I'm Anna Saucier, host of Cycle Power Summit 2019, and I'm here in this session with Alison Contreras. Alison has educated women and couples with knowledge of their fertility since 2009. She's trained as a Creighton fertility care practitioner, as well as a symptothermal instructor. In 2014, Alison joined the Fertility Appreciation Collaborative to Teach the Science, or FACS, one of our partners for the summit. She joined them as a program manager to complete the APPS research project, which was published in 2016. Alison, I am thrilled to have you here for the Cycle Power Summit. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. It's great to be here.
Fabulous. So, Alison, we want to dive into talking about apps. And it has gotten to be a little bit crazy how many fertility tracking and cycle tracking apps are out there right now. How many really are we talking about?
Yeah, Anna, there are so many apps on the market right now. It's definitely not necessarily the blue ocean anymore, but we're looking at by last count, over 1,000 different apps that are related to fertility or pregnancy. So we're kind of getting into the pregnancy, but fertility apps, there are a ton of apps out there.
Wow, that is a lot. And you're trying to keep up with it all.
Right. So at FACS, as you mentioned in my bio, one of the reasons that I was brought on a few years ago was actually in order to make sense of trying to understand and verify if these apps were really living up to the hype. So I think as long as women have been charting with fertility awareness, there has been this issue of organizing data. And it's just always been an issue of understanding and trying to figure out how most effectively to make sense of the information that we're recording on a daily basis. So we have women that are taking temperature, doing cervical observations, and the like, and it's just very necessary in order to minimize user error to have an effective way of organizing this information.
Yeah, so as you're talking about organizing information that we're collecting on our own bodies, and then we talk about how could we start organizing all of these apps and the different types of data that they track.
So I mentioned the issue of charting data and having trouble, remembering what day it is. And I wish I could have found a photo of a female, but I think we can all relate to maybe Tom Hanks in this photo. It's day 12. He has that look in his eyes, and he's trying to figure out maybe if there's a better way to chart his data.
I love it.
I think what's interesting about fertility awareness and charting is that there's always been this problem of figuring out our data, right? We have many different ways of charting data. Every different method has a different chart that comes with the method. In reality, it's kind of like an organizational nightmare, especially if you have many different biomarkers that you're looking at. So we have symptothermal charts where you can draw your own cover line. We have charts that just get into the nitty-gritty. We have women that are wanting to chart their feelings and how their mood changes throughout the cycle. And over time, we have basically been using technology in the form of a paper chart in order to understand what's happening in our body. And women come to using a fertility awareness-based method for many different reasons. I think we have all types of women that come, to learn in the first place. At the most basic level, we're trying to use this technology and information about our body in order to change our behavior. And paper charts can help us do that. And with the advent of smartphones and electronic charting has a great potential to be able to help us do this. Before there were apps, we had, this picture shown in the middle here is a cycle bead where it just helped women be able to count according to the standard days method. And back, in the 1930s and 40s, when the rhythm method was at the peak and the best thing we had available, there were tools in order to help women chart effectively. And these tools help women by avoiding and minimizing human error, right? There's always the user error issue when we're talking about fertility awareness. And what's interesting now is these apps not only help us to chart our fertility, but now with wearable sensors, they're actually helping us to be able to get new information. We're able to take data continuously. We don't just have to take our information in the morning at a certain time. But we have sensors that are also looking at our heartbeat and trying to correlate different biomarkers to the way that our body is expressing signs of fertility. And
it's so cool. And really, I think starting to take seriously this idea that this data that we're collecting is a vital sign. It's really important to our health.
Exactly.
And that we all, you know, should be using it, not just for family planning, but for health collection. So.
Exactly. And that this is information that every woman gives off, regardless of if she's wanting to have a baby or not. Right. We always have the potential to be able to look into this information. And I think technology has served us to understand the most basic signs that we can chart on paper. And it now also has the potential to help us, you know, understand other signs and chart those signs and incorporate that into an algorithm about our fertility. So I think, you know, traditionally there might have been a fear of technology. You know, what is these new information that we're becoming reliant upon? But the reality is that this information can help us be more human in the way that we respond to this information and then make our behavior choices accordingly. So I think that, you know, I have a client who's a night nurse. She has 12-hour shifts. She tracks her fertility she has different notes in her notepad on her phone. I have other, you know, clients that are teachers throughout the day, might not necessarily have a lot of breaks, you know, busy jobs, different schedules. And this technology that allows them to carry their charts with them is a huge benefit to them being able to more effectively chart and remember their observations. So I see a lot of potential and benefit to being able to electronically chart, which does bring me to a next point, which is the need and the desire is there from the user to have more efficient and effective charting habits and tools that will help them minimize user error. But there's different information and there's different reasons that these developers are coming into play with why they're developing apps. And I think it's worth looking into that because there are different motivations behind why people are developing apps in the first place. So we know that one of the original founders, Max Levchin, who was one of the funders for PayPal, he developed a fertility app based on some information he had working with couples he knew that were experiencing infertility. And they received a large financing and backing in order to bring this app to life. You know, over millions of dollars we're talking in financing. And his angle was that women who are charting their biomarkers really are super users in the sense that they are very invested in their health. So we should be looking at what they're bringing to the table because this is a huge preventative health benefit. And health insurance companies are probably very interested in this information. And if they're not yet, they will be shortly as soon as I show them what benefit it will bring to the table. So there's other developers that were, you know, I know that there were husbands of wives who were charting that saw the frustration and saw the you know, potential for human error and wanted to create charts. There are teaching organizations that were already invested in this process of teaching couples about their fertility, and they saw the need from their own users, and they also developed different apps. And of course, you know, everyone can, you know, have a different angle on what they see to be the, you know, the business aspect of what will continue the success of their app and create a sustainable business idea. And so there are different sensors on the market now. We have the Priya sensor, which is an insertable vaginal ring that has wireless charting with their app, as well as the Wink thermometer, which is wireless charting with the Kindara app. And there's several other sensors that have their own proprietary chart. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much out there. So, and that's an interesting point to think about. What was the goal behind the creator of a certain app or a certain piece of technology? Because
yeah,
we have
actually, it was really interesting. With Glow, one of their first ideas was to actually make IVF affordable for couples who were trying to conceive and having trouble. So they had their business model was that they would have you buy into like a subscription, and if at the end of a month, at the end of the year you hadn't conceived, then they would help pay for your assisted reproductive technologies in order to conceive. So I think that business model failed, and so I don't think they continued and they kind of pivoted and have several different apps now that they offer to different types of couples using and looking at their fertility, including single women as well as women that are trying to conceive and trying to avoid. So
fascinating. So then how do we as users sort through all of these different types of apps?
Right. Well, what we found at FACS was in our study that there's really different categories of apps. Not all apps are created equal. There's a plethora of them on the market, but there's really 4 main categories of apps. Many of them are no more than a glorified period tracker, which for many women, this might be exactly what they want, especially young women. There are other apps that provide the flexibility for an experienced user to use the information that they have about their method and chart electronically. So they're basically electronic charting tools. They give them real-time access and continuous access to their chart instead of having only one point of access when they're at home at night or in the morning, perhaps. The third category that we identified is an ovulation predictor category, where these apps are primarily used to conceive pregnancy in the sense that they'll identify the most likely time of fertility, but they won't fully define the fertile window, which is obviously then the fourth category, where statistically then these methods are the ones that you would want to be using if you were trying to avoid pregnancy and use a method for family planning, and that they're more effective in really identifying the fertile window on the front and back end, not just the day of most probable conception.
Okay, so I want to clarify this a little bit. So with the first type, when we're talking about period trackers, like something a teen might use, or somebody who's not, definitely not using this as a method of family planning, or really even as a health tool, but just to know when you're going to get your period, right? When to not wear white pants.
Exactly, and that's a huge tool for women, and to have that information readily available and easily tracked just by marking, you know, when you got your last period can be a helpful tool. The problem with that is if women do have irregular cycles, this might not be the most effective biomarker to just chart only, because typically it's only looking at your period, the start date of your period, and no other signs throughout the cycle.
Right, right. So it might take some historical data or something, but nothing,
Exactly.
nothing prospective. Okay, and so then the second is where maybe you charted on paper before, but you're going to be able to put in all of those data points now into an electronic app, and then really making your own evaluations and decisions just like you would have with your paper chart, right?
Exactly. This type of app is not interpreting your fertility. It is allowing you just the ease of charting wherever you need to.
Mm-hmm.
And then you still interpreting the signs that you're taught, that you have been taught to interpret based on your method.
Right. Okay, great. And then the third category, I think this was a really good point here, that these type of apps, ovulation predictors, I think I'm understanding this correctly, that they're designed for trying to conceive pregnancy. And so when you're looking at maybe they have an effectiveness rate, or this is a great app, but that's talking about mainly achieving pregnancy. And it's not designed to use as a method of family planning, right?
So this is the tricky category, in that many of these apps actually did still advertise effectiveness for avoiding.
Oh, they are advertising that as well.
Yeah, so that was a primary motivation for our study, because we did want to look at how accurately they were really identifying the fertile window. And what we found is during the publication of our study, and prior to the publication of our study, we had several, actually even after the publication of our study, we had several big fertility apps contact us and say that in their very, very fine print, you should never use this method to avoid pregnancy. But in their advertisement, they were using these effectiveness rates from literature that were not necessarily what they had ever tested their app to be effective on.
Okay, that's very important knowledge to consider.
Right, yep, we are all about transparency and trying to get that information to the user. So that was something that really made us motivated to get that study published.
Excellent. Yes, thank you for that. And so then the fourth category, fertile window definers, is collecting data and then interpreting when your fertile window, and actually, I mean, it's making that determination for you And so you're not actually evaluating your own data, but getting that right out of the app, right?
Exactly. Yeah, this is there are very few apps in this category that are doing this correctly or accurately. But as we see more apps developed and these apps tested, maybe we will have more effective apps that are defining the fertile window with accuracy that women want to see in a family planning method. But they really are doing the grunt work for you. They're interpreting. You are taking the signs, and they are, the ones in charge of creating defining that fertile window. So before I start to talk about specifically which apps might fall into each of those categories, I do want to talk about how we developed our study and what we were looking for. With our FACT study that was published in 2016, we identified certain criteria that we felt would be most important for women who are using these fertility apps. And we developed these criteria based on criteria that were previously developed to rate medical apps in the Family Practice Management Journal. And you can see them listed here on the screen. We looked at the authority that the teaching came from. Was the app associated with a teaching organization? How accurate was the method that they were using, and how accurate was the information that this app was giving the user? And if there was support, adaptability to the app, could it be used for different situations and in irregular cycles? What the cost of the app was, how easy to use was the app, and some criteria that were rated the least important but still pretty important for women were confidentiality. Did they express what they were doing with the information? A lot of these apps, the goal is to sell your information to create the bottom line. And we also looked at who was the developer of the app, how are they associated with a teacher, and how available the app was on different platforms. So what was interesting is when we developed these apps, these rating criteria as a FACTS team, we came up with them and assumed the interest of the user. But last year in 2018, the Georgetown group, the Institute of Reproductive Health, published a study where they did actually look at the different categories, and they asked 1,000 women who were using apps, what were their most important criteria for you choosing an app. And they looked at the category of trust, ease of use, and the attraction to the app, how beautiful it was, if they liked the font. Ease of use was how easy it was to enter data. Were they having to shift through multiple screens in order to enter their data, or was it just a 1-2 punch? And the trust category is really fascinating because they didn't particularly look at effectiveness of the app, but they were interested in how the user perceived trust in the app. Sure. Were they more likely to trust an app that was related to an organization, or were they more likely to trust an app that was published in a journal or had a lot of marketing? And what they found was that the women did trust the apps if there was published research on them, and if they were seen to be effective, and also if they were recommended by a friend. That was a high on their trust category. So what you recommend and what you share with people, do I know someone using this? Then it does make me want to learn more. But they did rate ease of use as fairly important. So one thing that I would change about our study, if I could go back in time, was to move up ease of use in our rating criteria, because we rated it a little lower thinking women would want accuracy at first, which is very important for using an app for family planning, but you can't underestimate how frustrating it can be to use a poorly designed app, and women won't use it if it's not designed well.
Right, absolutely, yeah. There's something that we have to remember to do every day, and if it's difficult to use, it's probably going to be difficult to remember because you're just not motivated to use something that's hard to use.
Exactly, and it's not taking the user error piece out of it. In fact, it's probably creating then more user error.
Yeah, that's a great point.
To use. So very briefly, I did want to do an overview of why our study is unique in terms of determining accuracy, because what we did with our study was we actually had reviewers who were trained, and we started off looking at 100 apps, narrowed it down based on our exclusion criteria, which were things like you can't change the data. It turns out the app doesn't change based on user input. and it turned out that the app was basically, just charting. It was charting your, it was assuming like a 28-day cycle, things like that. We ended up looking at 39 cycles, or 39 apps, excuse me. And what we did is we had standard data, cycle data, 7 different cycles from this model woman that was based on a real woman's data. And we inputted that into the app in order to see how effective the fertile window was that the app defined. So before we did that, the first thing that we did was we identified the standard cycle data and we compared it with the different methods that are found in literature to, I just want to redo that because I said a lot of things unnecessary. Okay. So in order to first look at accuracy, what we wanted to do was to compare the peer-reviewed evidence that was available for different methods compared to our standard cycle women data. So we had 7 cycles developed from a real woman's cycle data, and we inputted it using the algorithms that determine fertility for 7 different categories of evidence-based fertility awareness-based methods. And for more information on this, I highly recommend checking out Marguerite's talk on, Dr. Dwayne's talk on fertility awareness-based methods and effectiveness. But in these 7 categories, what we also then confirmed was that we had identified the fertile window properly with different experts. So then what we did with that same information was to compare what the app gave the woman. So we had many different reviewers who were trained to do this, and we had them input day by day these 7 months of data for our standard cycle data, and what the app gave us was what we called the app-defined fertile days. And what we would do is then compare that to the evidence-based fertile days that we knew were most effective according to the methods, and that is in the literature and the peer-reviewed literature. And so what would happen is there would be such things called false negatives and false positives, where not the fertile windows wouldn't fully overlap. And so what we found and what we rated in our rating criteria and our calculator was that if an app identified false negatives, meaning the app said, oh, these are days of infertility, you're safe here, when in reality those are actually days of fertility, we would dock the app points in the rating criteria. So this is primarily what we looked at in our study was how we could determine accuracy most effectively, and to see if the app was claiming the effectiveness of the symptothermal method, were they really following the symptothermal method in their calculation.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'm following this. So
okay.
You have data from a woman, and we evaluated the time of fertility and infertility by somebody who is trained in that method, say if they were just evaluating a paper chart, and then took the same data and put it into these different apps, got the same information about fertility and infertility, and then compared the two. Okay.
Exactly. And we also compared based on all of those other criteria that I first listed, but this is the one that was weighted the most heavily. We did have a weighting criteria based on our most important category. Again, since we thought accuracy would be the most important thing that a woman would be concerned with. So what we found was in the 39 apps that we reviewed, 29 were actively predicting or interpreting a fertile window for the user. And 10 of those did not do that. So basically we have 10 that are in that category that we first identified as the electronic charting tool, right? And at this point we have taken all of the period tracker apps out of this study. So basically the breakdown, you can kind of see that's on the screen. The majority of the apps were symptothermal in that they did take a temperature, they used temperature incorporated into the app. And what was interesting is that we had 2 proprietary method apps. So again, we did this study in 2016, and these were apps that had their own algorithm that did not claim to follow any different method and were claiming effectiveness. So this was kind of a new thing back then. A couple years later now, we have information on these apps, which I'll get to in a second. But these are the apps, these were the top apps that predicted or interpreted fertility. And what we found we did see different methods represented across the board. There were ovulation methods, symptothermal, and standard days app available across different platforms. And what's interesting is that these are all of the apps that rated in gray, all of the apps that were rated below a 4, which is what we considered a high accuracy. So the apps in green were rated above, they rated fairly effective, they rated, that's the best way to say that. The apps in green were above our threshold in terms of highly effective, and the apps in gray are the ones that were below the threshold in order. So we had a couple apps that were close, but had a couple things that were interestingly off about them. So these are, again, were the apps that predicted and interpreted fertility. And then in the group of apps that were electronic charting tools, we had 4 apps that were still fairly accurate, meaning that they scored above a 4 out of a 5-point scale. And these were the 4 apps listed here. And then these other apps were on below the threshold. And one caveat to this information that I guess I want to say is that several of these apps have come out with new versions, and there's many apps that are missing. FEM has a new algorithm that does interpret your fertility now. And if we go back to this slide, natural cycles is seen way down here, and what you'll see is it does have the proprietary algorithm. So this was a little tricky because the way that our rating tool was developed, it inherently incorporated if the app was based on an existing method. Now, since then, Natural Cycles has come out with their own effectiveness study on their app, but at the time of rating, that information was not available, and we found that it didn't line up with a symptothermal or any of the other methods that we have literature available on.
It must be so challenging to try and keep up with this stuff. It's still very, I think, very important to just start thinking about this, and especially to have those categories and evaluating as we're trying to select an app. First, if you want to use an app as a user, but then which app to use, where do I want to be in those categories? And then starting to go from there and understanding, okay, what was this app designed for? Even if I have 5 friends who are recommending to use it, what was it designed for, right? And what are my intentions?
Exactly. And what was fascinating about that 2018 study I referenced earlier, where they surveyed women who were they surveyed 1,000 women who were using apps. They listed out and they asked which app they were using, and almost none of these apps were on the list. These aren't the most popular apps. All of the apps that they were using are over here in gray. So I can't, their intention is definitely important if they were using it for family planning or if they were just using it for fertility tracking. I can't say, but if for family planning, these aren't the most popular apps. These aren't the apps with the most advertising and marketing. And that really does affect then who's going to find them and who's going to then use that information. So I do want to take a moment to discuss 2 apps that do have information and research now published on them. And this is like brand new information as of last week. These studies were one of these studies was released. And although so many apps are claiming effectiveness for fertility charting, really only 2 apps actually have research that's published so far. And that is Natural Cycles and the Dot app. And this is important because these are the first prospective studies that have been published on women who are real time in the study, and prospective studies are the gold standard when we're considering a family planning method.
So I want to ask you a question. Can you go back to that slide just for a clarifying question, Allison? That this is to say that there are methods out there that have effectiveness rates published based on their rules and charting. They may also have an app that works with their method, but the charting on the app itself does not have published research. So that these are actually the only app-based methods that have research studies done?
Yes, this is a great clarification point, because these are the only app-based methods. But all of the other fertility awareness-based methods that have peer-reviewed literature are assuming that the couple has been taught via the traditional methods of using the apps. They're not assuming that the woman has ever been taught by the app itself. So if a woman has been taught by a method and then goes to choose an app and charts on her own, that's an experienced user situation, right? Like she's bringing additional information to the table, and we can assume her effectiveness would vary accordingly. Whereas for these studies, they were actually looking at women that just started using this app and were being taught the instructions to chart from the app itself.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. So I'm going to just go into some of the effectiveness here of these studies. Natural cycles, which has been a lot in the news this past year. I'm sure most people have heard of this app now that are listening to this. But this is the first FDA-approved app, and it was developed in Europe, and it's a temperature-only algorithm. It's not incorporating cervical fluid, and it just uses a temperature correlation to identify if it's a green day, which is infertile, or a red day, which is fertile. And in the app, it will prompt users to abstain or use a barrier method on those days. So with the data that we're looking at from this study, about 40% of the cycle days were potentially fertile for a user. And this was a fairly large study. It had over 22,000 women that were using the app to avoid pregnancy, which is just a great number in terms of an effectiveness study. And what it found was that the typical use was a little over 8, and the perfect use was about 1. So there was a pretty high discontinuation rate, but to be honest, this isn't that unusual for fertility awareness methods, since women do tend to change their mind about their fertility related intentions, or if they don't like a method, they'll just stop using it. So we did have some concerns as a team about the method. One of them about the way the study was done, and some of it was about how they detected pregnancy, since it was all self-reported. And 3% of women, only 3% of women were disclosing their pregnancies through the app, and more women were then disclosing survey after they had follow-up, they were disclosing the pregnancies. So it's kind of a concern that maybe there were more women, or the women that discontinued, possibly there were more. And then the other thing is the robustness of the data. This is a prospective study that is possibly more generalizable, but not all of the women using the study disclosed when they had intercourse. So that's really important to be tracking all the information. And it's very hard to get women to track all their data points, but we really need to know when they were having intercourse in order to understand how effective it was. So, and the other point is that while they did ask and prompt the women to potentially use a barrier method during the fertile window, there's always a potential for undisclosed condom use rates, which can kind of affect then which method a woman is truly using, if they're using the fertility awareness method or if they're using the barrier as a method of avoiding pregnancy. So it just complicates, I think that is a consideration that complicates it especially for the user when they're trying to understand effectiveness. If some women are not going to be using these barrier methods, they still want to know how effective the method is. And the second app study that just came out on March 18th is a study out of Georgetown, and it was on the DOT app, and DOT stands for the Dynamic Optimal Timing app. And this was actually an app that was released the month after we published, or we shut down data collection in our app study in 2016. So we didn't get to include it then. But this is an app that's based on the standard days method, which is a modern calendar method, and it's a very easy and simple to use app in that it only requires a menstrual period input. And so it also requests that the women record their daily coital activity, and also if they want to get pregnant or not. The great thing about these new efficacy studies that coming out about fertility awareness is that they're asking women real-time what their pregnancy intentions are, because that's such an important thing to consider.
Right, absolutely. And even asking people what they did last week, brings the effectiveness down of your data, right? So being able to get it in real time for any information is so valuable.
Exactly. So this study was much smaller. It had about 300 women, but the typical use rates were very promising. The typical use pregnancy rate was 5%, and perfect use was 1%. And again, it had a very high discontinuation rate. With the some concerns on this type of method are that, for those of you unfamiliar with the standard days method, it automatically excludes women outside of a standard cycle data. If a woman doesn't have a certain cycle length, it's like 26 to 32 length for her cycle, she will be asked to leave. They will basically tell her that she's no longer eligible to use this method effectively for family planning. So that's really a very tight window of women, but it is a range of women. So there's some lack of generalization there. The study also looked at, they also excluded perimenopausal women. They went through and selected women who were kind of outside of their target category. So there's some concerns about the robustness of data there as well. And for this method as well, they did ask for condom use, and their perfect use data didn't include if the women were using condoms during the cycle. So again, I think that's very important for the population of women who are interested in using these methods to really parse out the difference between using condoms and using these methods for family planning by themselves. Otherwise, we're really looking at a combined rate that just gets tricky. Yeah. So these are the two studies. Again, I think there's very good information that's coming out by studying the apps. We're collecting a wealth of information and data, and really every app that's out there should have the potential to publish an efficacy study so we can understand exactly how well these apps are teaching women. Because I think that's really the whole in how we are understanding apps. We've traditionally taught women face-to-face, and now we're teaching women potentially through an app interface, which is a big unknown. We need more data on understanding how effective that is.
Yeah, fascinating. So as we kind of close this up and decide on action steps with all this information, exactly what app should I use and how do I make that decision? What questions do I need to ask myself first, and then begin to put myself into one of those categories and then choosing one from there?
That's a great question. So when I agreed to do this webinar, this is going to be the question that Anna asked me, and really, how am I going to answer which app someone should use? And I think there's kind of a profound shift there, because I do think, similarly to the way that we look at women's health, how we treat reproductive issues and concerns, and having this one-size-fits-all option that we've been historically relying on in the recent past, of having one contraceptive pill to really fix our problems. I think maybe in our subconscious we're still looking for that just one perfect app that will just make it easy to chart and easy to use a fertility awareness method. And from what I've seen in our research and what the data has shown is that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist now. Maybe it will exist in the future. But really, a woman has to ask herself a different question, and she has to understand what is it that she wants her app to do. For the experienced user, if she's looking for that electronic charting tool, there are great options that you can visit in our study. And if you're looking for this, woman who's just interested in charting her cycles and understanding when to expect menses and trying to decipher some of her mood swings, there's different apps that are going to be beneficial for her. So for the family planning piece, accuracy is obviously important. I would first be recommending at this point that the woman really try to seek out some in-person instruction, because of what we're seeing so far, except for those two studies that have kind of a narrow population of women that it would work for, we still need more information than the app is really giving us. So it would
still be your recommendation. And in another session, we dig into the different methods, researched methods that are out there. and the importance of working with an instructor. So it sounds like it still is the best option to learn an established method, especially, if we're talking especially for, you're going to use this for your family planning. You want to use a fertility awareness-based method for family planning to learn a method first, and then make your life easier by using an app.
Yeah, you know, I think what's interesting about why women started charting in the first place is because they wanted to have more information about their body, right? They learned what biomarkers to be looking for, and they started charting those on just a normal paper chart, and we're able to decipher and learn, you know, the simple instructions for what indicates fertility and what indicates infertility. And a woman was able to do this with a paper chart. And now what we're seeing with the advancement of the technology is the potential for the chart, the actual charting part of it, to be streamlined. I think when women originally started charting, they were wanting to have information about their body. And so they learned some different tools and tips about what their cervical fluid meant in terms of fertility, and what an increase in basal body temperature you know, would mean for their fertility. And they would record these using the technology of the paper chart. And with the advent of smartphone technology, we can now collect this information at a better rate that would be more feasible for women to continue these methods long term. And so what's interesting now is, as we're developing these apps with proprietary algorithms, that's kind of, those are kind of taking that control or empowerment about a woman's fertility away from them again. We're having the smartphone be the speaker of what her body is telling her. And so in a similar way that we had the doctor with all the information about our fertility before, we now, you know, we're trending in the direction of having the smartphone have all the information about our body. And I think it can potentially be very helpful for a population of women, but I think the one main reason that a lot of women are attracted to fertility awareness is that it gives them the tools to be able to understand their body. And so I would really encourage women to meet with a private instructor who helps empower you by understanding these things. It does take a little bit more time. I think, you know, maybe there are stages of life where an app is a great thing, that if you can use one of the effective apps, but I would kind of lean into that empowerment piece, because ultimately, if you understand the instructions, you're going to be so much more, in such a better place than if you just are relying on your smartphone to tell you. So,
right. So don't turn all of that empowerment back over to a device. That's a fantastic point. Alison, last thing here, we're asking all of our guest speakers to share their #1 cycle power tip.
Awesome. So my #1 cycle power tip would be to find an app that is easily able to help you share your chart, because you never know in the future when you would want to share your chart with your doctor. And so you want to make sure that you can download or email it easily.
That is super helpful, because then you can put it on paper, and sometimes it's easier just to look at something on paper. You can see the whole thing, and then it truly becomes that it's a powerful health tool, like you said, to take to your doctor and use for something so powerful, just as we can use it for family planning, but it can actually be a health tool. Awesome.
Yeah, you never know when something might start happening to your chart and you need that information for another purpose in your life besides just fertility.
Fabulous. Alison, thank you so much for joining me for this session. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Anna.